Okay, well, I would like to welcome everybody. Thank you very much for participating in our next webinar from the Egmont Institute. We really have the honor to be with one of the main analysts, most important analysts of politics and security in Angola. Dr. Paula Cristina Roque has published widely about Angola and also about South Sudan. And she has been an independent analyst for 18 years about conflict analysis and human security in Africa. She has an endless series of responsibilities and titles. She is a senior external advisor and co-founder of the South Sudan Center for Strategic and Policy Issues in Juba in South Sudan. She has been an analyst, senior analyst for Southern Africa with the International Crisis Group, the Horn of Africa Senior Researchers for Institute of Security Studies in Pretoria. She's working as a China and Africa Research Coordinator for the Southern African Institute for International Affairs. And she has a PhD in Development Studies from the University of Oxford, where, if I understood it well, she made a comparison between SPLM in South Sudan and UNITA in Angola. As we all know, Angola is not an easy country to do research on, but I think she did an incredible work by analyzing the more hidden aspects of the regime in Angola, which was put together in a book, recent book on African arguments, which I can show you. It's Governing in the Shadows, Angola Securitized State, and I absolutely advise you to read it. It's really extremely interesting. So thank you very much, Dr. Roque. If I can, before I give you the floor, maybe I can suggest that if you have questions for Dr. Roque during her presentation, please send these through the Q&A functionality, which is at the bottom of the Zoom application. You can send the questions, and she will do her best to answer them accordingly. So thank you very much, and please, Dr. Roque, I give you the floor.
Thank you so much. It's always an honor and pleasure to be invited by Egmont. The last time I was there, I was also talking about Angola, and so many years have passed, and things in one way have remained the same. In another way, Angola is facing a moment of existential transformation, and I will get to that. So I think I'm going to share my screen so we can do the, I can go through the PowerPoint presentation. So Angola had elections in August, the 24th of August this year, and they were highly contested. We were all expecting a lot of contestation at the street level because the opposition had gained a lot of traction nationally. Angola was in many ways facing a deep and widespread socioeconomic crisis. What some people have claimed is a state of permanent recession and deepening poverty. I mean, we saw that across the globe with the pandemic, but not just the pandemic. Since 2017, with President João Lourenço's coming into tenure, we've had basic food staples in Angola called the Cesta Básica have increased in terms of their prices about 400%. So we've seen in Angola the great and vast majority of the population, 70% and above, that are multidimensionally poor. So they are facing different levels of deprivation, not just in terms of food insecurity and lack of access to jobs, but also lack of adequate housing and healthcare and education. So the situation has worsened in a very, very distinct way. We've seen hunger in the south of the country, and even in Luanda, in the capital, of levels that were only reached and seen during the war. So Angola hadn't experienced this kind of difficulties for 20 years. So the prelude to the 24th of August polls had several elements that that led this to be existential and important. And one of the things was the MPLA was divided, deeply divided. The death of the previous president of José Eduardo dos Santos only deepened those rifts. So there was, it became a very ugly affair that the children on one side did not want the body of their father to leave Barcelona. The courts were involved. The head of the Presidential Bureau for Security was in Barcelona trying to get the former president's body taken to Luanda. And the lack of dignity and the very personalized, at least it was interpreted within the MPLA and broadly in society, the very personalized attack of President Lourenço on dos Santos and his clan showed that it was a personal attack, but it was also very vengeful. And it still continues. And so when President dos Santos' body arrived in Luanda, he had very few of the ceremonial distinctions of what a former president, a former head of states that in Angola governed for almost 40 years. In fact, a few weeks ago, we had an Angolan musician of a very, street level music called Kuduro, and his nickname, Nagrelha, and he had more people and more ceremonial aspects to his funeral than actual President dos Santos. So this caused a lot of angst and resentment within the MPLA. So a divided MPLA heading towards polls where the population feels disenfranchised, where the opposition is strong and united. You had, for the first time in the Angolan cycle of elections, you had three movements that were joined together under the Frente Patriótica Unida, so the United Patriotic Front. You had UNITA, which everyone knows is the main opposition party, but then you had a political platform, Para Já, that was created by a former UNITA, but also very charismatic opposition figure, Abel Chivukuvuku, and a group of, and party, a Bloc de Esquerda, the Democratic Bloc, not Bloc de Esquerda, Bloc Democratic, sorry, the Democratic Bloc, that was set up for the first elections in Angola in '92. And they are a group of intellectuals that have been have done incredible work at the street level, at the grassroots level, mobilizing activists, mobilizing the urban youth. And they themselves are, in many ways, the leadership are dissidents of the MPLA. So this broad coalition became a very interesting and quite unusual group that said, okay, UNITA cannot go ahead alone. We need the youth, we need activists, we need to broaden our representation, we need to broaden our ability to impact change. Also, civil society was incredibly dynamic in the run-up to the elections. We had debates, not just in social media, but on the ground level, within radios, that showed that that the youth and activists were very much involved. Political debates were going on that were, uncomfortable for many of an older generation because they were saying hard truths. And so Movimento Cívico Mudei was a group of civil society movements, several of them, that came together and said, and they were polling almost monthly on how the MPLA would do, how the opposition would do. And the monthly polls were very much showing that the MPLA was losing ground. In fact, most of the time, the MPLA would have like 10 percentage points difference between UNITA that was winning. And so this created such a level of discomfort that the government said, okay, we've banned entities, and they created a very serious and difficult restrictions at the financial also, but at a bureaucratic level. We saw in 2002 an increased rhetoric from the government, from civilian ministers, but also from ministers linked to the Presidential Security Bureau, which I'll explain to you is very much the nerve center of power in Angola, but also very much emblematic of a securitized state, which is the main idea behind what the book that Eric was referring to. And so the increase of terror, of insecurity, of instability was increasing as protests were increasing in 2021. So protests that had nothing to do with politics. So it wasn't the opposition that were taking people to the streets. It's, you know, in one case, it had to do with taxi drivers, and that devolved into a level of vandalism. And so the rhetoric was the opposition is trying to create terror and make this country ungovernable. So they were equating, and this is not new because they had done in the past, the opposition with insecurity. And so this again plays into the old rhetoric that the MPLA has had, which is if Angolans value their peace, if Angolans value their stability, then the MPLA has naturally to stay in power, because once the MPLA is taken out of power, anything can happen, and instability, even war can return. And this has been a rhetoric that they've had since the end of the war in 2002. So we also had two interesting Angobarometer and Afrobarometer. Now, Afrobarometer works across the continent, and it's a very credible and an independent institution. And it does, for the first time, bring into the debate voices that aren't normally brought in. So normally, you know, analysts work within the levels. It's an academic and a political elite conversation. They never really bring the voices from the average citizen. Africa Barometer does, and they staged some polls. And they showed for the first time, I mean, and this was to the credit of President João Lourenço, that allowed them to operate in Angola. And the polls showed that the MPLA would face a likely defeat. Now, they showed in one way, Angobarometer for sure showed there was a defeat, but Afrobarometer wasn't that clear. It showed that there was a third of the population refused to say who they were going to vote for. So the MPLA and UNITA stood on par with the respondents. And so it could have gone either way. And it's interesting because why weren't they showing where they would vote? What happened also was there was international concern with the Ukraine war. And the high oil prices allowed a buffer of funds and revenue from oil to allow the government of Angola, that had been working for several years now with a budget deficit, had allowed them almost like a buffer of money that they could use for other things, and most likely they used for other strategies that were used in the past, of co-optation, of not only civil society, but voters, traditional authorities, etc., etc. Then we also saw the use of the courts as political and partisan instruments against, in this case, UNITA, by trying to get UNITA's new president, Adalberto da Costa Jr., out of the presidency of UNITA, claiming he had dual nationality. And it was, you know, very much an instrument to deconstruct the opposition. So these were more or less the setting in the prelude to the August elections. Now, my main theory regarding securitization is, you know, in the post-war state, in the very much the Angola Rising set of analysis, where we had people looking at this, patrimonialist and neo-patrimonialist elements that kept the elites united, the elites capturing the economy and keeping Dos Santos in power in a very, very sophisticated but a very pragmatic way. Always in the past, they've always tended to ignore what underpinned this, and what underpinned this was a vast security apparatus, a vast security apparatus of political control. And in this, we've had, securitization became a post-conflict state building exercise, a speech act, which is what securitization is. So when people claim something is a security threat, it moves politics in the direction of allowing for extreme measures. So, for example, when we had COVID, we had a lot of governments come and use they enacted emergency powers and took everyday politics into a level of emergency because the existential threat to society was a virus. And you saw a lot of them dressed in military fatigues, others using the rhetoric of, declaring war on the virus. So that's the rhetorical side, the speech act side. But it's also a pathology of government, which was built by President Dos Santos during the war, so in the 80s specifically, and then continued to be perfected throughout the 90s, and was expanded upon after the war ended. Now, it's aimed at hegemonic dominance and the political survival of the MPLA. So it's there to make sure that the MPLA has political longevity. But it operates with a zero-sum mentality, and zero-sum mentalities don't work for democracy and they don't work for peacetime. For war, it makes sense because it's either an us or a them. For one to win, everyone else has to lose. But in peacetime, you're supposed to bring in all the social political in one sense or another to help rebuild the country. But it was also a strategy of national security that views and continues to view permanent threats to the MPLA's control and power. So the logic of securitization is looking at permanent threats that didn't exist. So they may have existed during the war, clearly, because UNITA was a formidable opponent and a very aggressive insurgency. But in peacetime, UNITA completely disarmed and demilitarized. There was a mass humanitarian crisis, and people wanted peace and stability. They did not want anything that involved any contestation of any sort. So it was, seeing crises and existential threats where they didn't exist. But it was also political, an infrastructure protecting the political order. Like I said, allowing other dynamics of neo-patrimonialism, massification of party structures, and access to economic opportunity. So you had military and political apparatchiks that was very, very much brought into the system of clientelism and these monopolistic structures of enrichment. That was a way of, if you are part of the system, you will be part of protecting it rather than taking it down. And so this opened up even further access by security elites and the military generals to access to resources. Now, the presidency used securitization to align interests and to combat dissidents, instrumentalize fear, and manage the state. So securitization aligned interests in the sense that the MPLA from within and without had many competing interests. But if you had a structure that could manage those, And you could combat dissidents from within through an infiltration, through looking at the interests of different political members of the MPLA, not just the opposition and not just civil society, but also allowed a omnipresent sense of instrumentalizing fear. Now, a securitized state, and we've seen this with other states on the continent where, you know, I would say Rwanda is a securitized state, Zimbabwe is a securitized state, Uganda, Ethiopia, South Sudan. I mean, there are quite a few, and they react with violence and infiltration, subversion and intimidations to threats that they deem are existential, but that easily could have had political and social solutions so that they could be amenable to resolution. You know, politically, the issue of, for example, Cabinda, the enclave that is, you know, still has a low-level conflict in Angola, you know, for 60 years, is amenable to resolution because there are political and economic issues that are very present that could be resolved through negotiation and haven't so far. So the securitized state, at least under President not João Lourenço, sorry, the former president dos Santos, imagined and orchestrated situations of insecurity to also legitimize security responses. So you'll remember the case in 2015 of the youths, the 15+2 book club coup, where there was no coup d'etat, there was no intention of a coup d'etat, but these youths were accused of wanting to stage a coup, and they were put on trial for it. So it was a very difficult. That's one of the cases of you instrumentalize and you orchestrate situations that you can then say, actually, our response is that we need to respond with force, and we need to evoke massacres of the past, which they did. So you've had, you know, two massacres in Angola that have very much been part of the historical memory of people. One was the 1977 massacre, which was an internal MPLA purge that very much constrained and brought into order any dissident voices within the MPLA. And then you had the 1992 massacre, post-election massacre, where, according to church estimates, about 40,000 UNITA supporters and key members of the leadership were massacred on the streets in Luanda over 3 days after the elections. And so, and these are the ones that very much come into play when there are threats, and they also come into play during elections. So the presidency is the apex of power. So two big institutions are the ones that retain power of the presidency. You have the Security Bureau and you have the Civilian Bureau. The Security Bureau has a lot more power, but together these megastructures supervise the work of the cabinet, they shadow the work, they duplicate the work, they instrumentalize and direct the work of a lot of their colleagues of the executive, of the judiciary. They also control some of the most important portfolios that the country has. So the National Reconstruction Portfolio, which was the China file. So all of when Angola didn't have a donor conference, China came in with soft loans, and this was held in the Security Bureau of the Presidency, which in fact created a unit called the DCPS unit, which was an armed unit only to protect Chinese commercial interests, which is unheard of. So it also had to do with elections. So every time elections were coming up, the tendering of companies that were going to print the ballot papers, that were going to supply a lot of the logistics and materials for the elections to occur, were contracted by the Security Bureau of the Presidency. Again, Cabinda, of the 18 provinces in Angola, Cabinda is the only one that is uniquely governed by the Security Bureau. It has an existing governor, but yet that governor has very little power. And then elite enrichment control. So Dos Santos was very clear in keeping tabs on who was stealing where and with what interests, so that he could also keep them in line and ensure their loyalty. Now, it commanded several parallel structures, and the Praetorian Guard, so the Presidential Guard, became the best trained and most efficient of those structures. You had the use of intelligence services. There are several. I'll get to that in a bit. That were positioned to infiltrate, create surveillance networks and promote intrigue in the opposition, in civil society movements, even within the armed forces. And then you had an overinflated, and that's still the case today, defense budget. That, for example, in 2022, the defense budget was of 12% of the overall budget. And that's more than what has been set aside for education, and is equal to what has been set aside for health. Now, the issue is you then have other ways. The president has a discretionary fund that he normally may use to reinforce the capabilities of his own presidential guard and his the presidency and the Security Bureau himself. You have the emasculation, in this case, of the executive and the parliament, and the very concerted efforts to direct the actions of the judiciary. So this is very much the nerve center of power in Angola. You also have, the Praetorian Guard. Now, presidential guards, like and Eric that works in the region will know this is, better, is they play important roles. They are parallel armies to ensure political longevity and the survival of centralized presidential power. Now, when this was something that Agostinho Neto, the first president of Angola, learned, which was when there was an attempted coup from a more radical faction within the MPLA in 1977. It was the Cuban troops that kept him from losing power, and elements of the presidential guard. Now, because in that case, several units from the military joined these more rebellious factions that wanted reforms at a real level. And then he learned, well, the presidential guard is there to protect me against any problems that the military or security forces could create. That was reinforced in 1992. As you will remember, 1992 began a transformative element of where, democracy was introduced. You had the joining of the two armies of UNITA and the MPLA. So, they dismantled the one-party rule, and President Dos Santos at the time took a lot of the elements that he had and shadowed them even more. So the presidential guard was increased so that, because of UNITA bringing in their own soldiers into a joint army, and also because UNITA was bringing in several of its politicians into a government of national unity that then happened only in 97. So it has several units. It has the presidential, the guard of the unit of presidential protection, the unit of presidential guard, Chacal, which is allegedly a very much unique and elite troop group of individuals that are trained by the Israelis and the North Koreans. But in many ways, they are, I think this is more the psychological warfare of saying we have an elite troop, and I don't really know what actions they have had to exemplify that elite troop. I mean, there's some rumors went in that they have been deployed to assist in direct allies in Zimbabwe, in the Ivory Coast with President Gbagbo, even in the DRC. But all of these forces, more importantly, are here to protect against existential threats inside Angola, existential threats to the president and to the hegemony of the MPLA. They also have parallel structures that operate outside existing structures. So they have their own intelligence services, they have their own finance department, they have their own telecommunication services. So these operate in tandem to ones that already exist. The intelligence services, this is very interesting because they have in a way, the operational motto of, God in heaven, state on earth. Which provides a sense of omnipresence. And like I mentioned before, there are at least officially 3 services. One deals with external intelligence, one with military intelligence, one with internal domestic intelligence. And they, again, have a vertical alignment of command and reporting, which reports not to their, not, for example, to their respective ministry, which would be the Ministry of Interior, but they go straight to the head of the Presidential Bureau, which for many years under General, dos Santos was General Copelipa. Again, you also had the same happening with the chief of general staff of the army that would report not to the Minister of Defense, but go straight and report to General Copelipa. So it was very much a vertical alignment of reporting and control. Now, they all kind of coalesced in a sense about, what were they meant to do? They were meant to control the society and manage any problems that arose, but they were also there to infiltrate members of the party and the armed forces. Now, the intelligence, the domestic intelligence outfit, SINS, was very much, and this actually was very clear in explaining this to me, was, our mandate is to fight subversion in whichever form it may be. I mean, in this case, people are thinking right now, subversion is posting whatever you want, bad-mouthing the president. That could be explained, could be deemed as a subversive activity, and because there has been a hardening of this kind of thinking since the elections in August. But it's also, the mandate is also to infiltrate and destabilize political parties. So you had a lot of SINS operatives that were working in the offices of UNITA and other parties. And they later came to the fore when they figured out that these guys were actually intelligence officers that were there to be the eyes and ears of the presidency in all sectors. So not just the opposition, but in civil society and NGOs, in the private sector as well. Now, SIM, which is military intelligence, was the most hardline of all of the services under dos Santos. It was run by a very detested figure, General José Maria, who contributed in a very clear way in promoting intrigue and weakened the leadership of the armed forces. Now, the Angolan armed forces, the FAR, were many years, and we naturally know why, they were the only institution that had a national character. So not only in terms of, they were coming in from all the 18 provinces, from rural and urban areas, from, the interior and the coast, but also the fact that they were a joining of two armies that had fought against each other. So the armed forces were only the most emblematic of the national and the national reconciliation element of peacetime and peacemaking efforts in Angola. So anything that attempted to dismantle that was a threat. But the military intelligence did that actively. So to deconstruct what was very much a legitimate, a highly respected institution across the board in the country. In fact, Afrobarometer, one of the polls that they did across the provinces showed that the population didn't trust the government. They didn't trust the political elites of the opposition either. The three main elements that they trusted were the armed forces, the church, and traditional authorities, which is very interesting in themselves. So the military intelligence also had this non-written rule of sidelining the people, the provenientes. Provenientes means those that came from UNITA. So those that actually were inside the FAR, so inside the armed forces, that had come in as a result of the Bicesse and Lusaka and Luena peace agreements. Now, the Service C of external intelligence has operated at many times as an extension of the foreign ministry. So we saw with Angola's interests in the Central African Republic that Oliveira Sango, which was the head of C at the time, was the one promoting the unity of several of the factions, Excelica, etc., trying to bring them on board so that there could be a unified conversation between the government and the armed groups. You're probably going to find that the operations and their reach in the regions in the two Congos is very wide too. And so it's been interesting to see that they are operating as an extension of the foreign ministry, which, by the way, was President dos Santos' most beloved portfolio. And he showed himself to be incredibly astute, incredibly sophisticated and brilliant in terms of managing competing interests and contradictions during the Cold War and in post-Cold War. Hold on. I don't know why this isn't now going. Okay. Now, what did João Lourenço, when he came in, what did he do differently? So instead of, he came in a self-assumed situation of, I'm going to be the Deng Xiaoping of Angola. So he came in as an economic reformer, not a political reformer. But, you cannot reform the economy if you do not reform how the political system works, because it's all intertwined. So you have, you cannot decentralize, diversify the economy, which is one of the pillars of his economic policy, without decentralizing politically, because all the interests in key sectors are held by a group of political leaders and political families. Again, attached to the MPLA. So he doubled down on securitization, also because of the creeping divisions within the MPLA already seen in 2017 when he took office. He had to ensure that the power base, his power base, was outside the political meanderings and wrangling of the MPLA, but also to safeguard his own personal security, because he understood that. So, for example, when President dos Santos, just before he left office, he put in he decreed that the head of the security elites were not to be touched, just to ensure that the security state that he had put in effect was still controlled by people that were loyal to him. The first thing that João Lourenço did was to dismiss and change the heads of these security and the different units. And so he had to make sure that they were safeguard his personal security. And in fact, he placed his brother, General Cerqueira, as head of the Presidential Guard. But he also did something else, which was he politicized the army. And inserted, in a way we hadn't seen before, former political commissars. Now, former, political commissars were used in during the war on both sides, MPLA and UNITA used them, and they were there. Now they, the MPLA calls them officers of patriotic education. He took out the chief of staff of the army, General Nunda at the time, and replaced him with General Chiplina, who was the head of patriotic education of the armed forces. Now, political commissars did not govern, did not command troops. And this created a bit of a problem for, the rank and file that had the experience of working under respected, professional, and incredibly, myth-like commanders during the war on both sides. And suddenly they're being, told what to do by a former political commissar that very much politicized the army. And he did that quite actively, but it wasn't just in the army that former political commissars were put. Also the head of the Security Bureau at the time, Pedro Sebastião, was also a former political commissar. João Lourenço is a general, so the only president of the three presidents of Angola that has a military background, but he too was a political commissar. So he started placing them. He put a general as the attorney general. So placing in key strategic places a lot of his former comrades that would ensure loyalty directly to him. He also increased the partisan use of the intelligence services, potentially also duplicated some of the services. Different people were reporting to him at different times of the day. But the partisan use of the intelligence services was to deploy SINS, which was, that's the domestic intelligence service, to become part of a multi-sectoral commission that included the Attorney General's office, included the police, included Sonangol, to investigate corruption, which was his main goal that served several purposes, which was you you select those that are supposed to be sacrificed in corruption. You make sure that everyone else that's spared knows that they owe their survival and loyalty to President João Lourenço, who does not go after them and their estate and their assets. But also it served the purpose of sanitizing internationally an image that was, constantly seen and built and exposed as a very, very corrupt country. So it brought legitimacy to him in that sense. But then I put something that's a bit controversial here. So a few weeks ago, the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army, General Camurteiro. Now, General Camurteiro was the UNITA Chief of Staff that signed the Luena Accords that ended the war after Savimbi was killed in 2002. General Camurteiro was positioned to be the next Chief of Staff. Again, he came from UNITA, and I, inside sources were telling me very clearly that that was the choice, that he was going to be the next Chief of Staff of the Army. And other generals, one even very openly came out and said he did not die of natural causes. Family members came and said he was poisoned. And so it begs the question, if the president was going to put him in, who would have, if he was poisoned, which we don't know and there's no proof of it, but who would have done this? So also we saw a lot of divisions from within the class of generals in the run-up to the elections. But we also saw that the army themselves and the police, the rank and file, had very much voted against the MPLA. But I will get to that in a bit. So So, okay, so securitization and democracy and good governance are incompatible. So, you know, you can have a facade democracy, which is the case of Angola, but they're very much underpinned by different elements. So when you work in a democracy, you need to have, you know, ability to openly discuss ideas, even go against historical interpretations, the identity of the country, and alternative visions, political visions. And that you know, pluralism is very much what that is about in many ways. In securitization, the difference is enemy. Again, this is very much the zero-sum mentality of the war that got brought on to peacetime. Now, a government that is afraid of change and is unable to control change. Now, it was able to control change in the first few years post-war. So, you know, Dos Santos was very much able to control change, reaching, you know, the peak in 2008 of the windfall of oil production. And then it stopped being able to control the pace of change when 2014 oil prices hit. And then it went, and the exposure of decay was just very much brought to the fore. So a government, you know, that is afraid of change will not reform itself out of power. So, you know, as much as João Lourenço claims to be a reformer, he is not going to reform anything that would put in jeopardy the MPLA's longevity, but him personally too. And so hence why he can reform just a little bit, but not enough to do that. So again, securitization and democracy work on separate tenets. Now, also the problem is the elite stranglehold of the economy and the resource dependence of the economy were very much, and still are, obstacles to decentralization and diversification of the economy. I mean, Angola remains one of the most unequal countries in the world. Resource distribution is tied to the need to maintain a large defense budget. And so poverty reduction programs, sustainable development projects have very much been at the fore of electoral campaigns, but they don't really factor into the everyday life and benefit of the average citizen. So they're left at a rhetoric level, and very much for, you know, electioneering purposes. Now, also, this is the interesting thing, because it very much applied to these August elections. When a securitized state organizes elections, it mobilizes loyalties, but more importantly, it tries to neutralize the opposition's ability to act by instrumentalizing fear. Because if you create fear, it's obviously a political construct. It portrays elections as threats to peace, security, and stability of the state. Now, this logic of security clearly is meant as an intimidation tactic that limits the opposition, the media, and civil society. But it also justifies tactics to manipulate the process under the guise of legitimately protecting peace and stability. So, you know, you will see that was the rhetoric that I mentioned at the beginning of terror, instability, disorder that was being used by key, you know, generals and officers and ministers within the presidency, that was saying, you know, you cannot push for certain reforms because you are risking the stability and the peace that Angolans have so hardly fought for, which is, yeah, I mean, it makes no sense, because it you know, in a democratic turnover, stability is not equated with one political party, especially if the popular vote goes towards change. And so in this case, it did, but this was not allowed to happen. Now, I wrote an article just after the elections, and I called it, you know, Anatomy of the Stolen Elections. Now, you know, for many years, UNITA and several opposition parties have been claiming foul of the elections in terms of, we've been victims of mass manipulation, of mass fraud, etc., but they never showed evidence, not really. And the evidence that they did show, they wouldn't make it public. They took it to the Constitutional Court, which acts as an electoral court. And these, but this year they showed evidence, and this was what they showed. So you'll see here in the screen, sorry, it's a bit blurry, that there was a parallel count that UNITA did that showed that the MPLA, so in this case, João Lourenço, got 48.2%, whilst UNITA under Adalberto Costa Jr. got 49.5%. Now, of course, very narrow difference, but it was based on 95% of the electoral sheets of the over 13,280 whatever polling stations around the country. Now, this wasn't just the problem, it was the fact that, looking before, you had an electoral commission that wasn't independent. It was completely dominated by the MPLA. You had on the voters' roll, and this is one of the things that the head, former president of Cape Verde, who was heading the electoral commission of the CPLP, which is the Portuguese-speaking countries, mentioned, which was you had 2.7 million voters that no longer existed. They were on the voters' roll, but they were dead. I mean, even Jonas Savimbi was there. But this gives a leeway to not to create an opacity to, we don't know how many people truly voted. And it helps, it gives some leeway to work with numbers. So that, in this province, more people voted because we actually don't know of those 2.7 million, how many voted. So in total, we had, including these, about 14 million people that were registered to vote. There were very few election observers. There was less than 1,800, again, for over 13,200 polling stations. So it was, anecdotal that they could actually see anything that where, irregularities were happening. Then this was a change that was made, which was very problematic, which was the tabulation of results would only occur at municipal and provincial levels. So if you take out the steps of counting and recounting and recognizing, it takes out key elements of accountability and transparency of the process of counting votes. And so they would count the votes in each of the polling stations. They are supposed to, by law, put the results sheets outside the polling station so the public that voted there could see. And then they send the ballot boxes, all, I don't know how many ballot boxes, straight to Luanda to be counted at a national tabulation center, which, was affected by the 2 weeks before the elections on the 16th of August, the National Electoral Commission, which is basically an administrative body, decreed two changes, which it had no authority to do. One was that each of those result sheets in the election, in the polling stations, would not have the number of voters that voted. So you would have, 300 voted for the MPLA, 400 voted for UNITA, and 6 voted for FNLA. And they wouldn't actually tabulate and add all those numbers at the end of how many people actually voted, including people that spoiled ballots, blank ballots, invalid ballots, whatever. And this was a problem, again, because you could add numbers. So you could add one number in front of the 400 and you'd have 1,400. So it was a very big problem. Why wouldn't this? And a big irregularity in the election law. Then it was, or the second decree was limiting the access to the tabulation center in Luanda. So the president of this, of the Electoral Commission said, actually, we are only going to allow a certain number commissioners of the Electoral Commission and a technical group, which meant that the great majority, and I believe none of the opposition members of the Electoral Commission were actually part of the voting of the counting of votes in Luanda. So UNITA took the Constitutional Court, took their results to the Constitutional Court and said, what we want is not to invalidate and we do not want a rerun of the elections. What we want is for the Electoral Commission to compare. We have 95% of the results sheets of all of thousands of polling stations. We want us to show us how did they get to their number of 51% for the MPLA and 44% for UNITA when ours showed that that we won by less than 2%. And so, which would, of course, naturally, had it been respected, been a very difficult way to govern for either of them. And the Constitutional Court dismissed the claims and refused a recount, which you think, why would it do that? I mean, it infringes the most basic level of public probity. Again, international complicity because of the war in Ukraine. And people said, you know, economic interests and stability in Angola are more important than democracy. Now, what happened after the Constitutional Court decided that, you know, UNITA's claims were dismissed and they were invalid was the armed forces were moved to the highest level of combat readiness for 3 weeks. So from the 5th to the 20th of September. Now, João Lourenço's inauguration was on the 15th. And they were expecting, because there were mass calls from the FPU coalition, which included UNITA, for people to take to the streets, for protests, mass protests. And they were afraid of that. So they put they put Kamazi trucks, some of them, I mean, armored vehicles. I mean, they came to the ridiculous point that they had, you know, these huge and heavy artillery pieces in residential areas and lining the streets with tanks, etc. Then these are pieces that you see on TV when you watch what's being supplied to the Ukrainian armed forces. I mean, clearly these are not areas to use in population centers. And so it was such an overreaction in terms of the heavy presence of the military and the heavy presence of the rapid response police, which are known as the ninjas, and they are quite brutal, that people said they started being afraid. And so, you know, people were also saying, you know, we are afraid that fear may end. And if fear is ending, it means that people will take to the streets. Now, you cannot, now, UNITA clearly, hands down, and the MPLA recognize this, lost the capital vote. The MPLA lost the capital vote, UNITA won it. Now, the electoral percentage of those in Luanda was 1/3 of the electorate is in Luanda. So, which begs the question, if 1/3 of the electorate voted and won and voted for the opposition, how is it that all the other remaining 17 provinces somehow miraculously voted enough for the MPLA to give them a victory? It's impossible. Well, it's not impossible, but it's highly improbable. And so, and then also, of course, there were issues showing that in polling stations near the headquarters or the barracks of the police and the army in Luanda, those polling stations, clearly where these security units were voted all for UNITA. So the rank and file was very much voting for change. And this also scared the president. We started seeing the domestic intelligence services since and unknown groups. So, in the past, we've seen activists being attacked by political militias that are, because of deniability, linked to MPLA cells. And circulating elimination lists of activists and opposition leaders, marking with stickers the homes of several of these people with a skull and blood saying, "You have been marked." And there were death lists. Arbitrary detentions were just, going in a very difficult direction. Intimidation of the press started happening with the investigation service of the police, and finally, we saw this heavy militarized and almost like a capital under siege in Luanda, and you thought, and the excuse was, we are going to, during the presidential inauguration, have a military parade. It was a Putin-style military parade. I mean, it was unbelievable. The military parade took longer than the actual ceremony. And people thought, no, this is invocations of war. This is a very, very clear message that if the opposition takes to the streets, they will be killed. And I remember speaking to some people in military intelligence and asking them, I said, is there a kill order, shoot to kill order, if the opposition and activists take to the streets and call millions of their supporters? And they said yes. And they said, and the opposition know this. So UNITA backed down. Now, the demography of the country, so, this echoed the 1992 massacres and the post-election massacres in 1992 in the country's first elections, where, UNITA's vice president, secretary general, Savimbi's nephew, etc., were killed. I remember activists were incredibly angry that UNITA and other members of the FPU alliance were not taking to the streets and calling for mass protests. And they said, 70% of the population is less than 30 years old. They have no recollection of the war, certainly don't have any recollection of the 92 massacres. And I said, yes, but the problem is all of the leadership of UNITA were all there. They all are traumatized by the 92 massacres. So they themselves said, we're not going to take our people and our supporters to be killed and gunned down. So, in post-election developments, we actually, in the president's speech during his inauguration, he said that the salaries of the police and the armed forces, I think at this point it comes down to almost 270,000 combined. So not even talking about the intelligence services or the National Guards and all the other paramilitary groups, would be increased. So subsidies, salaries, they'd get more money. In our already hyperinflated defense budgets, the salaries would now cost 1.7 billion a year, which is 4 times the amount assigned to health in 2022. There was also exposure by some not activists, but investigative journalists, that the judges of the Constitutional Court were, in the run-up to UNITA's contestation of results, were awarded over 100 million kwanza, which more or less, give or take, is 200,000 US dollars, and a diamond ring each. Now, this was widely put in the press. I don't know if it's true or not, but I think it was. We've also had, now, part of when the IMF came into Angola, and Lorenzo said, we're going to ensure the macro stability of the country and begin economic reforms. He said, we're going to do and roll out a massive privatization program of, I think, if I'm not mistaken, over 200 state-owned enterprises. So what he did now is he reversed some of those, and he took out Sonangol, which is, the jewel of the crown of Angola, out of the specter of privatization for now. And he also nationalized the leading telecommunications company, Unitel, that was owned by elements of Infor. So Sonangol, Isabel dos Santos, the former president's daughter, General Dino, which was also one of the advisors of President dos Santos, and there was another, who was it that, BFA, which I think it was which is an Angolan bank. So he nationalized 50% of the positions, because he combined the positions of Isabel, the daughter, and General Dino. And it was a nationalization based not on economic necessities, but in an effort to create a new generation of oligarchs and create more oligarchistic or whatever monopolies in the economy. So Unitel, which has a revenue of $1 billion a year, did not have any sustainability issues or survivability issues that economically justified its nationalization. In fact, then these investigative journalists said the positions that were taken from Isabel and from General Dino have now been given through other shell companies to companies connected to João Lourenço, to the current president. So, and one of them is this one, the Omatapalo company that has, a lot of links to the presidency in all sorts of areas, but mostly construction. And this is, again, it bodes very badly for a president that said he was going to come oh, sorry, my last slide. So, the choices really here is, can we see Angola heading in the direction of reform, or are we going to continue seeing it heading and slowly sliding into greater authoritarian democracy? And I personally think that it's actually heading into greater aspects of authoritarianism. We haven't seen, we've seen more attacks on the media. Journalists are being threatened. I mean, in fact, we saw a lot of TV stations being incorporated into the state rather than, and they were private news stations. We've started seeing again, funds that should have gone into alleviating, the famine in the south of Angola and the desperate socioeconomic situation of urban populations that are unable to farm, went into keeping the military and the police happy. I mean, we've seen a level of even buying of military equipment and hardware through the Defense Ministry's company Simportex. I mean, for me, it shows that there is a very almost like a parallel understanding of what's happening in Angola. One is, well, we're going to implement our projects regardless, and the other one is, well, Angola is at a crossroads. It's in a very fragile state, and we cannot risk a lot of this spiraling into a level of instability that could create a serious crisis in Angola. And that crisis also includes, looking at how a lot of the looting and the lack of maintenance of military units can also have effects now if, for example, Angola has to intervene in the DR Congo's situation, or even just protect its own borders. So I think we're going to see very much a regression. A lot of the gains of the electoral gains and the democratic gains are going to be reversed. And we are leading, in my view, to a more opaque and authoritarian state. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roque, for your fascinating presentation. I think it's really, as said before, Angola is not an easy country to investigate, and you provided a lot of clarity on what is going on in the country. Thank you very much for that. I see there are only 2 questions that were registered. I hope there will be more. The first one is about a possible, 3 questions. The first one is a possible trade-off between the US recognition of the victory of the MPLA and, on the other hand, a change of the policy of neutrality of Angola towards the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. As the first question, I don't know what you think of that.
So the Americans and the European Union took much longer than their counterparts in Africa to actually congratulate João Lourenço on his victory. Their wording was very diplomatic. They said, we congratulate the people of Angola for an orderly election, and that was it. And they waited, because they wanted to understand what was the evidence of UNITA and the FPU's parallel count and the evidence that they had. Now, UNITA and the FPU had 3 different parallel tabulation centers, because they found that they were constantly being infiltrated, and so they couldn't trust a lot of people, and it took them a lot longer. And it took them so long that that they lost the opportunity to actually capitalize on the silence of the Western governments. I know that later some African governments, when they did come with evidence of fraud, they said, this is unbelievable, it's shocking, but we have already congratulated the president. And so, and yes, I think there was absolutely, a shift, which was, it wasn't a policy so much of neutrality that they had. You need the MPLA and the security apparatus that upholds it was very much under the modus operandi, and very much built in the image of Russia, or in this case, the Soviet Union and Cuba. And it very much informs the MO of several units. So Russia is the biggest defense ally for Angola. Naturally, it's its ally, and always the Angolan elites and a lot of MPLA members said to me, Russia has a loyalty. The Americans have no permanent friends, only permanent interests. And so, because for them, they saw how quickly Washington shifted from 92 in supporting UNITA to suddenly recognizing the MPLA and declaring UNITA a terrorist organization. So yes, I think there was very much a deal which says, okay, you help us with several things, including ensuring the stability in the Central African region, which is a big concern for the US, and they know Angola has a big capacity to bring in people together, and said, it's you show neutrality and you help us with mediation of issues. And you've seen that Angola's getting involved again. So yes, I think you're very right.
Thank you very much, Dr. Roque. So we go maybe to the second question, which was an anonymous participant who asked whether the campaign against corruption by President Lourenço is only meant to show to foreign countries that Angola is frequentable, or there may be other objectives or finalities behind it.
Well, I think, I wouldn't want to dismiss outright the genuine will initially to transform macroeconomically the country. I think bringing in the IMF and the World Bank and others wasn't an easy step for President Lourenço. So, they had to open their books. They had to be exposed to a lot of the requirements, including a lot of changes that put at risk the subsidies in fuels, etc., introduction of new taxes, which affected even the poorest of Angolans. So they became very unpopular measures. But they came at a time where Angola needed to be almost shielded from the impacts of the volatility of the markets and the oil crisis. So for him, he said, okay, we're going to bring in the IMF. And this was important because, of course, it also did have, it spiked investor confidence because they thought, okay, well, these guys are being serious. They're trying to recover billions of dollars of stolen funds from people connected to the previous administration. And at the same time, they're bringing in the IMF and other international credit institutions to look into the books of the country. But now the program is over. And I think Angola will need again to seek out more help. And we, a lot of us were saying, well, they would only do it post-elections. So let's see if they do go back to the IMF or not. But the reality is that more and more reports are coming out that João Lourenço has not only not combated corruption, but he's changed hands of the beneficiaries. So now it's his own people and it's his own family that are benefiting from corruption.
Okay, thank you very much. There's just a little question whether there are rumors about efforts from the presidency to have a third presidential term and so to change the constitution. Do you think this is based on reality or?
So, the constitutional reform is something that that I believe is a reality. I think the opposition also want it. The opposition want the constitution to change in very many ways. One is reducing the powers of the presidency, giving parliament more powers of checks and balances. It's also one of the opposition requirements is that the president is elected directly, not through party lists, and also that local elections take place and that governors are directly elected. So they're not elected or nominated via the president. So this is something that the opposition wants. The MPLA does not have the number of MPs. You need a 2/3 majority. They are lacking, if I'm not mistaken, they are lacking 24 members of parliament to be able to do that. And so what could happen, and this is, some of the analysts coming out saying, well, they could try and reach a deal with UNITA, which is, yes, we will shape the constitution to make sure that presidential elections are direct. So you would have parliamentary elections separate from presidential elections, but in return, you make sure that we start from zero again. So this would not be my second term. We would go to zero again, which is what Dos Santos did with the changing of the 2010 constitution, so that Lourenço would be able to run again for a third term. So it's a very tricky thing, and it has to be looked at very carefully. So let's see what the wrangling is there. And you know, UNITA and the Patriotic Front have lost so much, not support, but people are so they're angry that they even took their parliamentary seats when they knew that they had won. And why did they go along with the farce of the MPLA governing and taking their places in a government that didn't belong to them? So, you know, this has to be very well managed on both sides.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It seems like reminds of Burundi. Well, next one is as I know, there has in recent years that Angola has done, or the presidency has done a lot of efforts for a reconciliation process with the Civicop Commission. I hope I pronounced it correctly. So that the current president has taken more steps than his predecessor in discussing the massacres of 1977 and 92. Why did it happen, do you think? Why did he do this?
So I think this was one of the things that the president did really well. He, you know, again, when he came in, he did several things right. One was, I need to start going after those that are looting the state, and that it's untenable to keep the corruption going the way it has been, in a rampant way. The other thing is, I'm going to open the political space so that there is more debate. And he invited into the palace, you know, key critics of the MPLA, key activists, key human rights defenders, and said, you know, this is a new era for us. And he also had very conciliatory measures where he said, okay, so now the body of Jonas Savimbi will be handed in to the family and to UNITA, so you could give him a proper burial. And he did. He also gave the remains of several of the UNITA leaders that were massacred in 92. And that was really important, I mean, for healing. He has discussed the 1977 massacre, but there is no consensus. I mean, that it's still about, you know, this group of people, which was a faction within the MPLA, was staging a coup against Agostinho Neto, and the people that actually the people that survived, and that their family members said there was no coup. What they wanted was that response to their elements of concern, that people, that the general population was poor and getting poorer, and they were mismanaging their policies. And so we wanted more extreme pro-poor responses to the economy. And so he has taken some steps, but then, you know, a lot of the other steps go in the wrong direction. You know, they're almost invalidated to an extent, because you steal the election from an opposition coalition. You try and put, you know, and it didn't stick. A lot of the intelligence services looking for criminal actions that the opposition leader could have had from, you know, very unsavory actions that they got people to accuse him of, but they didn't stick. Because if they had had the ability to put him into a criminal process, it could potentially invalidate his ability to run for the elections. And so, you know, yes, in one way, he's gone and done the right thing, but in the other way, you know, no. And so reconciliation in Angola will have to be done on a socially and economically just basis. Because people, yes, political reconciliation is great, but if there is no social and economic justice, people don't really care about the politics. Also because the identities of so many are still being rejected. You know, they do not accept that, for example, in certain institutions, that you have people from the South. You have most of them are from people of the North. that are controlling the most viable, the most economically and politically important institutions in the country. So that, you know, there are many things that you can unpack in terms of looking at, on one way, yes, but another way goes so deep, the disenfranchisement, that it's just not enough.
Oh, thank you. So this, you immediately answered an additional question that was whether the Angolan population is really interested in the reconciliation process in its current form. So the answer was clearly no, unless other conditions are met. So we have a very last one, because we're approaching the end of our seminar, unfortunately. Do you think we will have municipal elections during this legislature?
I doubt them. This was UNITA's big call. So what's happening now is something very interesting. Now, so Angola has, I can't remember the exact number, but 100, I think it's 162, oh goodness, municipalities. So it's at a municipal level that these elections would happen. And municipalities are then comprised. So within the 18 provinces, each province has a municipality. Municipality then is broken down all the way to the commune level. Now, Angola has over 500 communes. And there's a new proposition coming forward saying, actually, let's break down all the existing political administrative boundaries and make those municipalities. So Angola would have 581 municipalities. And you're thinking, how does that make sense? Because, you know, it would cost the state almost $1 billion extra to have to staff people in salaries. And we're not even talking about the infrastructure necessary. So is it that this is a gerrymandering issue? I mean, they said the government was actually, we are trying to bring services closer to the people. But the services don't exist at a municipal level as is. And so you want to create more municipalities. And this will delay tremendously, because you have to then delineate the municipalities, the 581 municipalities. They would create 2 additional provinces. They'd have to create buildings, staff people, draft all the legislation around this, budget for this, which they don't have money for, and then create roads. And you're thinking, all right, so if this is the basis upon which you're going to have local elections, then it's really a humongous amount of work that needs to be done in order to allow for this. And it is a complete contradiction of what the MPLA had started doing before, which was the gradual process. So o gradualismo, which was instead of going to all the 100 and something municipalities all at once, let's do it gradually. So we would have a municipality here in Luanda, or several in Luanda as a first run, maybe a few in the Central Highlands, but we wouldn't do them all at the same time. So now it's the opposite. It's like, actually, let's create even more chaos and even more municipalities so that we have to manage even more difficult election processes. So I don't know. I do not think we will be able to. They will fight about this. But again, you know, the opposition has no standing because the parliament is a rubber stamp institution.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much, Dr. Roque, for your fascinating insights, and I'm sure we can go on with you. Hear the encyclopedic knowledge you have about everything in Angola. We can certainly go on until the end of next week, but unfortunately, we don't have the time for that. But I hope we can still call you whenever it's necessary. We appreciate very, very much your participation, and thank you so much that you gave us this fascinating lecture.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, and thanks to all the participants who took some of their time to take part in this. And I hope we can hear it next time. Probably it will be Jason Stearns, who will have a lecture on the 10th of January about his latest book about the situation in the Great Lakes region. Okay, but we'll let you know. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. Have a good Christmas. All the best. Thank you.